So, there's the incumbent Liberal Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Obviously, you've no doubt heard about some of his recent exploits.
He's a very theatrical fellow.
Yeah, very much so. He's kind of
he commits to certain character.
Yeah, very much. He's a kind of international brand, kind of walking listicle, who's been with us for the last few years. He won election in 2015. And then you've got the Conservative Party led by Andrew Scheer, who was kind of a compromise candidate. They wanted the wackier one, but they had a weird voting system, so Andrew Scheer won.
Who is the wackier one?
We're going to get to him in a second. He's also leading a political party.
But wait, wasn't there also? I remember when this happened earlier. There was a chance that Canada was going to follow in our footsteps of having a rich TV reality show dickhead become a party leader, because the guy from Shark Tank made an attempt to be the Conservative Party leader, right? Mr. Wonderful.
That's right. Kevin O'Leary tried to run for leader of the Conservative Party, and actually, it seemed like having declared his candidacy, he spent a lot of time just like traveling around the United States and not really campaigning at all. So because of the obvious Trump parallel, a lot of people freaked out in Canada, and they were like, oh God, it's happening here. And there were a bunch of conservative candidates that tried to kind of emulate Donald Trump's style. There was one who started putting like exclamation marks at the end of her tweets. And she started talking about how we're going to drain the canal, referring to the Rideau Canal in Ottawa, which is near the Parliament buildings. But none of that really caught on. And Andrew Scheer ended up winning the leadership. He's about as interesting as watching paint dry. And he was the Speaker of the House of Commons for many years. And when he stopped being Speaker, it turned out he was just like a pretty run of the mill, social and fiscal conservative. The Conservatives are running on kind of the usual suite of like dueling tax credits that they have with the Liberals. Not very interesting. But the guy who was kind of the first choice of Conservative Party members, Maxime Bernier, who is a former foreign minister, he is leading what's now called the People's Party of Canada. This is the first election they've contested. And it's much more of the kind of, it's much more obviously a kind of far right formation. I think, they've kind of hemorrhaged some candidates. They've had trouble finding candidates. I think a few candidates left because they were like, oh God, there seemed to be a lot of racists here. But so he's in the running. It's not clear how much they're catching on. Then you've got the Green Party, which is sort of, as Donald said in his intro, they're kind of a not left, not right before. They sometimes get mistaken for a kind of left of center party. And it's not that they're cryptically right wing. They're just kind of not really anything. If in downtown Toronto, a lot of their candidates would be sort of, urban progressive, bicycle riding types. And then they would also have candidates that are the type of people that like, have made a whole bunch of dodgy comments on abortion and post like 9/11 conspiracy videos on Facebook and stuff like that. And they're kind of a leader-centric brand. They've had the same leader for quite some time. Her name's Elizabeth May, and it is kind of the Elizabeth May party in some ways. And then you've got the NDP, which is kind of one of the places I got my political start, I guess 10 or 11 years ago when I was kind of first getting involved in politics. It's Canada's social democratic party. It comes out of the prairie populism and the kind of radical Methodist Christianity of kind of the early 20th century. It was kind of founded as a coalition. Its predecessor, the CCF, was kind of a coalition of farmers, industrial workers, and socialist intellectuals. They merged with the Canadian Labour Congress in the early 60s to create the NDP. The NDP is kind of the social democratic option in Canada these days. So those are kind of the play. Oh, and then God, there are so many parties this election. There's also the Bloc Québécois, who are the kind of federal wing of the Quebec sovereignty movement. Shouldn't leave them out.
I guess like in thinking about all this, like Americans, like sort of certainly liberal Americans have a kind of stereotype about Canada that it is the nice country that we all wish we could live in because people are polite and there's some kind of a decent healthcare system.
Yeah.
But like overall, that's not really the case. I mean, like Canada is almost as reactionary a shithole as America is, right?
Yeah, I mean the thing about the American caricature, right, is that because Canada is such a small country, the way that other countries see us is sort of as important to our identity as any kind of like organic identity that we might have. So, a lot of people abroad think of Canada as this sort of post-racial Scandinavia or something like that. And that's kind of what a lot of Canadians think too. Our official identity is very much that we're this sort of progressive multicultural utopia.
Your formal multiculturalist policy.
Yeah, there is. There's like state, it is state policy, as is bilingualism. And I mean, I shouldn't, downplay, there are obviously, multiculturalism in Canada, I think has been more successful than, in many other countries. There are definitely strengths to making it kind of a part of the civic identity. But the flip side is that I think Canadians are not very good at introspecting about the deficiencies and the problems in their own society, and so it can kind of end up being a sort of institutionalized complacency.
So it's Trudeau is the incumbent, right? And Trudeau's a guy who came to power after nearly a decade of rule by a right-wing government led by Stephen Harper, who I think you've described as the angry hockey dad vote. That's his constituency. That's who he is and who he represents, right?
Yeah, very much so. So the Conservative Party, I mean, they have a lot of rural support, but Stephen Harper's majority government in 2011 was kind of won on the backs of suburban voters and especially the Greater Toronto area. But yeah, the roots of Trudeau-ism definitely go back to the Harper era. And in retrospect, looking back at that time, like when the Conservatives, when they'd just been in power for a few years, I was starting university, and I kind of saw the birth of the political identity that I think ended up blossoming into Trudeau-ism, which, again, in retrospect, was kind of our own sort of meeker, more provincial version of what is now the anti-Trump resistance.
Yeah,
the Harper years, they gave birth to this political identity that was sort of, I guess you could say small p progressive. And it was very shrill and kind of hyperbolic about the Conservative Party. So, I remember all these kind of memes circa 2007, 2008 about warning signs of fascism or whatever, that kind of thing. But there wasn't really there. You guys know the type. So, and it was ultimately very focused on all the norms and the institutions whose dignity the Conservatives were supposedly insulting. It was very into using the language of patriotism, to talking about the Constitution, and all of it really was just about being, anti-conservative. Like ABC, anything but conservative, was a label that people actually used and which voters actually kind of assigned to themselves. It didn't really have a program attached to it. It wasn't about replacing Harper with anything in particular. It was just about, replacing him, period. So even though its kind of language was progressive, I think ultimately what the people who were attracted to that wanted was a sort of conservative restoration, which is very much the case for a Joe Biden presidency right now.
It sounds a bit
it's very analogous to that.
It sounds like a kind of a woke Blairism. It's funny you make that parallel to the sorts of figures we have in the United States, wine moms, epic rant dads, the denizens of the anti-Trump online resistance, and they love Trudeau. They idolize him in the way that they love Macron, because they, whenever Trudeau sits down with Trump, they analyze the footage for evidence of shade that Trudeau is throwing at Trump.
Well, Luke, I was going to say, another huge parallel between Trudeau and these types of people, or at least stylistically, is the intense horniness for him among a certain segment of the population. It's just always about how suave and hot he is, and that plays it's a big part of his appeal, especially with the contrast with Donald Trump.
You're saying that appeal is it's mostly cultural, just the production of a reaction against Harper, but without any kind of ideological content, just a sort of worshiping of the image. Because at the end of the day, Justin Trudeau is just the fail son of a former prime minister. He's just a celebrity.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few things at work here. I mean, I think, one of them is, as you mentioned, kind of the horniness and like more broadly, Trudeau is just, in some ways the product of like an oversaturated, social media driven and like celebrity obsessive culture. He's the political equivalent. He offers people twee uplift in the way that like something like Upworthy did. If you guys remember that, like awful website. It was like, it's like, Upworthy plus like traditional centrist politics. So that's part of it, right? Like he had viral potential. And, after he got elected, there were headlines, that were things like, Justin Trudeau's 7 secrets to being extraordinarily charming, or, meet the Prime Minister of Canada, our new man crush. These are actual headlines. This was one I liked. Canadian PM Justin Trudeau is really, really ridiculously good looking. And yes, it matters.
So when, as obsessed as you all are with American politics, I mean, Trump meeting Trudeau is obviously a big event. And do you agree with the analysis from our libs that, Justin Trudeau threw some epic shade and made Donald Trump look like a little boy? Is that how you perceive these meetings?
Well, not me personally, but I can tell you that lots of people in Canada absolutely received them that kind of way. Back in 2017, when Trudeau visited the White House, there was this hilarious moment where I guess Trudeau and Trump had some kind of press conference, I guess in the Oval Office or somewhere in the White House. And there's a still image where Trump is holding his outstretched hand. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but Trump is holding his outstretched hand and Trudeau is just kind of looking at it.
I can't see Donald Trump's outstretched hand unless I have a microscope.
Right. Yeah, he's orange too. But yeah, so, in the still image, Trudeau is like, looking like he's just kind of, caustically gazing down at Trump's hand and sort of in defiance, not shaking it. But of course, like seconds later, he's just like smiling for the cameras and shaking Trump's hand. So this is like exactly the same as, when Nancy Pelosi epically throws shade by, kind of cryptically, sassily clapping at Trump during the State of the Union address. And then people have to do sort of alchemy and divination to invent ways that this is somehow like a brave act of defiance. That's very much what like, the Trudeau brand as kind of a defier of Trump is about. It's about things like that.
So the big question I have is, we know the Trudeau demographic, both here in the United States and in Canada, what the liberal base is now. Is Trump standing among the epic rant dads and the wine moms hurt or helped by doing blackface for his entire life?
The reactions to that, it's not exactly clear. I think it's an indictment of, the electorate that it hasn't instantly cut into, the liberal numbers in the polls. It does seem to be hurting Trudeau's personal ratings, right? I mean, it's the ultimate inversion of his brand as the like ultimate performative woke guy.
Yeah.
But I mean, so far it does not. It has as of yet it has not like really hurt his the liberal reelection campaign. And what's amazing is that he's basically trying to run a very similar campaign to the one he ran in 2015, like post blackface. I mean, I guess they're making less of an effort to pretend to be progressive, but they're running, he's still showing up at press conferences like in a canoe, like paddling up to the shore in a canoe and things like that. He's still doing all the same.
But how do they, how do they resolve this cognitive dissonance? When
very carefully.
Originally,
if I can walk to that one, motherfucker.
Originally, the dissonance was: here's the guy who's very performatively woke, and he wears all the costumes, and he feels your pain and all that shit. Pretends to care about indigenous people or the plight of others overseas, while selling arms to Saudi Arabia and trampling over indigenous land rights and so on and so forth. Ontarians, what do we call them? The LaCroix Ontarians.
I don't care, dude.
Yeah. I guess that never troubled them, but surely now that it's an image that's maddening to them, Like, surely that will cause their brains to finally explode. That there's blackface plus woke guy.
I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. Like the Trudeau brand does have a remarkable capacity to recover, because it turns out that, I mean, I know it'll surprise you guys, but that a lot of people who talk endlessly about social justice kind of bend on it pretty quickly as soon as their own standards become inconvenient.
Yeah.
So, the sort of media cycle after the scandal broke, he came out and he kind of did an apology, and he said, like, I didn't know that this stuff hurt people. And he was asked by the media, well, did you do it? Did you do it any more than once? And he said, well, there was a time in a high school talent show when I did it. And I also sang Deo. And then they said, and I'm pretty sure at that press conference, he was also asked, well, were there any other times? And he said no. But then the next morning, Global News got a video showing a third instance of him doing it. And, after that, he said, I'm wary of being definitive about this because recent pictures that came out, I had not remembered. And the question is, how can you not remember that?
The thing is, this isn't just the answer is because he's done it so many times. It's just,
or the answer is that when it happens, he goes into a fugue state. It's sort of like the Incredible Hulk. And
it's like the woke version of not criminally responsible.
Yeah, he doesn't remember it.
But I'm saying that it's one thing if this is a grainy yearbook photo that came out. This is the son of the former prime minister, and he's in full body blackface. Like,
right, and he was in his 30s, and he was a teacher at the school where this happened. I mean, yeah.
I didn't even know that part.
Absolutely.
I think we've just discovered our first, fracture between American and Canadian politics, because the idea that in America you could be like representing a liberal constituency of a major political party running for the leadership of the country after crassly pretending to be like not another race for most of your life and get away with it is just unthinkable here.
It's not really clear how this didn't come out before, because there were lots of people at these events. I mean, one of the videos is dated from the early 90s, so it goes further back. But all of these things seem to have happened before he got into politics. But it is kind of a wonder that this didn't come out before. And I mean, one of the things about Trudeau's brand is that it's always been treated as sort of too big to fail. Like, whenever he's kind of deviated from, what his image is on paper, which is like, the, ultra woke performative guy, everyone just kind of ignores it. Right. So, like in his big Rolling Stone interview, which I think came out in 2017, something like that, he's talking about this ridiculous charity boxing match that was kind of one of the things that, as absurd as it sounds, kind of elevated him nationally. And he was in politics at this point, and his opponent in that match was this Indigenous senator. And he says in the interview, he just straight up says, I wanted someone who would be a good foil, and we stumbled upon the scrappy, tough guy senator from an Indigenous community. He fit the bill, and it was a very nice counterpoint. And so he was, raked over the coals by, Indigenous activists over that, but it was just kind of ignored, just like it was ignored in the 2015 federal election, when in an interview, he seemed to account for violence against women by blaming rap music. People just sort of always overlooked that kind of thing.
No, so nobody knew about the blackface beforehand. When you're telling me he was, this was in the context of a class or a live performance. So theoretically, hundreds of people like just saw him in blackface and forgot about it.
Yeah, I guess so.
Going further into Trudeau, you wrote a very good article in Current Affairs about Trudeau called Justin Trudeau and the Politics of Spectacle. But these parallels emerge again because, he comes into office after, like a decade of a right-wing government. Like, he's young, he's good looking, he seems to embody the hopes of a younger generation and a desire to sort of shift course, right? And, exactly like Obama did. And everyone, myself included, felt positive at that moment. But then, you go into it and, right off the bat, you talk about like what are some of the things he ran on that, again, as soon as he got in office, immediately backed off on?
Yeah, so it was very much like Obama in that a lot of people who thought, who voted liberal thought that they were voting for like, anti-war, tax the rich kind of government, and needless to say, that's not what they got. I guess Trudeau's political skill, insofar as he had one, was that he was able to kind of adopt progressive language while not really. He wasn't in retro. I mean, as with Obama, right? Like Obama was going around in 2008 praising Ronald Reagan, but none of us kind of noticed or cared. We all thought that he was. We all thought that he was kind of a figure of the left in some way, and Trudeau,
or that he was doing it like to be politically canny and like assuage moderates' instincts, or like about that him as some sort of wild foreign radical or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. It was all part of the 24-dimensional game of chess, which I guess Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have now taken up. I don't know what move they're on at this point, but yeah. So it was, it was the liberal platform, had all this kind of, I guess, like softly left language around, taxing the rich, doing deficit spending, on around indigenous rights, around climate change. And I mean, if you actually looked into the details, there was nothing particularly radical about it. I mean, they're running to the right of the NDP, definitely. But, Trudeau, kind of ingeniously towed the line. And I think that, Trudeau himself is not a very interesting figure because he's exactly as you see him. He's, a trust fund kid who grew up rich and famous and then, kind of inherited political power largely on the basis of his last name. But the Trudeau phenomenon, I think, is interesting in some ways because at a time when, liberalism was just kind of taking L's everywhere, when, populism, particularly of the right-wing variety, was on the rise all over the world, the Trudeau liberals kind of found the perfect formula. They figured out how you could kind of you could speak to the concerns of working and middle class people who were concerned about inequality and climate change and things like that. But you could also reassure the global elite, the people who are afraid of populism, that you weren't actually really going to do anything. Mm-hmm. And
that sounds why, kind of familiar.
So I mean, one of the reasons why Trudeau became an international brand is because so many traditional political actors, like centrists in other countries, basically looked at this and they thought, God, how do we copy this? This is absolute genius. And Trudeau was just the perfect package for this because he had the veneer of youth. But I mean, essentially he was cashing in on sort of, baby boomer nostalgia for, the era of his dad, which was like Canada in the, the swinging 60s. So it was, it was the perfect, electoral brand. It was, kind of a message that was ultimately about a conservative restoration, but with sort of an aura of novelty attached to it. They figured out a way to give traditional political power a veneer of social conscience at a time when liberals everywhere else were, had completely lost it when it came to doing that and winning elections.
And speaking to this, I guess like one of the most galling things, both from the perspective of his, sort of woke branding, but also like actual moral and political commitments, is the issue of like First Nations and like Indigenous land rights in Canada. Like he had like some proposal that would give First Nations the communities like total veto power over like land leases and like cultivation of like their land, basically. What happened with that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so that was abandoned because I guess the need to build pipelines is just too important.
So it was abandoned when it was realized this will prevent the other thing we wanted to.
Yeah,
it was abandoned when they realized they might exercise those powers we might give them.
Yeah, that's right. And there was another thing. They were going to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They actually went to the United Nations and announced that, and they were like, the time is now, and then a couple months later, they were like, oh yeah, no, we're not doing that.
Or he I believe the quote that you have is that they said that this just isn't workable.
That's right. Yeah.
Which
sort of begs the question, why did they promise to do it in the first place?
Speaking of pipelines, didn't that motherfucker march in the climate strike?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That's
yeah, he marched against himself.
Yeah.
Luke, what has the Liberal government done then? What have they delivered on?
I mean, insofar as they actually committed to do anything specific, they've flip-flopped on a lot of the big, like, specific commitments. So they were also going to change Canada's electoral system. They just dropped that. We have like an archaic 19th century electoral system where people
that
win.
Must suck.
Like 100, yeah,
19th century.
Sorry about that, dude.
Fuck off.
It's not. Yeah,
I kill for a 19th century electoral system.
It's not as bad as yours, admittedly, but it's pretty bad. You can basically get like 100% of the legislative power with as little as like 34 or 35% of the popular vote, which maybe that could benefit a left-wing party someday. That would be great, but mostly it hasn't done that. But so, yeah, they abandoned electoral reform. I mean, they were also going to raise taxes on the rich, which, I mean, officially they did do that. They created a new tax bracket for, I think it was incomes above $200,000. But then they also cut taxes for the income tax bracket below. So it's actually a net tax cut. And the most of the gains, or the majority of the gains, went to the top 10% of earners. So it's just a total sleight of hand. It's the kind of thing you can imagine like the Center for American Progress coming up with or something. I mean, they did create a child benefit, which I guess is like a means tested grant that goes disproportionately to low income families. The problem with that was that they advanced it kind of explicitly in opposition to a universal childcare program. The Liberals, just like the Democrats, like love means testing.
What about refugees and migration?
Yeah, so I mean, the rhetoric around refugees was certainly, much better than anything coming out of the United States. I mean, the NDP in 2015 had a more ambitious program to admit more refugees, which the Liberals attacked the NDP program and then essentially ended up adopting it. I'm actually kind of forgetting the details. It's been a few years. So Trudeau, at least did make a kind of an effort to symbolically embrace the refugee issue. And he tweeted a number of things that I guess were cryptically interpreted as condemnations of Trump. But Canada took, I think a decent number of refugees, but like many fewer per capita than, other countries, I think particularly those in Scandinavia. And I mean, when it comes to actually, updating border policy, I mean, Canadian authorities are still cooperating with, your own border authorities and things like that. So I think very little has changed there.
What you get at in the current affairs piece is that like Trudeau as a political model, like sort of picking up the ball from Obama and running with it. Like what's attractive to you about it is that like, you have the look of a guy who's sort of
black, who's
POC occasionally, but but also like it represents kind of a wholesome, unthreatening masculinity. We have one article here from when he was first election. Justin Trudeau's election redefined politics of manliness, study suggests. And this is, an academic study which purports to claim that, Justin Trudeau is he's hot, he's jacked, but he also has feelings and has a boyish sort of demeanor. But more importantly, it's this thing about his politics are about saying things in such a way that reassures all involved that he's one of you without actually saying or committing to anything, and really reassuring party elites and the wealthy that he's not going to rock the boat, right? And you have
very much so.
And there's one quote here again that we're like, sometimes, like you said, like the mask slips or like the algorithm breaks down a little bit and like too much of what he's actually talking about gets through. So he says here, this was in response to a question You write about how his government was navigating the unpopularity of neoliberal globalization at the present political moment. And he said this, quote, "We were able to sign a free trade agreement with Europe at a time when people tend to be closing off. We're actually able to approve pipelines at a time when everyone wants protection of the environment. We're being able to show that we get people's fears and there are constructive ways of allaying them and not just ways to lash out and give a big kick to the system." So what he's really saying is like, my politics is about allaying people's fears about the things that I'm doing.
That's right. And I mean, as with Obama, that was always, that was always clear. That was always something he made explicit from the beginning. There was an op-ed that he published. I can't remember in which newspaper it was published. I think in 2013, 2014, something like that. And this was when he was laying out what was supposedly the liberals' like anti-inequality agenda. And he said, national business leaders and other wealthy Canadians should draw the following conclusion and do so urgently. If we do not solve, the problems facing the middle class and low income earners, and these are Trudeau's words, Canadians will eventually withdraw their support for a growth agenda. We will all be worse off. As a consequence, deepening anxiety yields deepening divisions, and people will begin to vote for leaders who offer comforting stories about who to blame for our problems rather than how to solve them. So he basically was addressing, business leaders and people like that, and he was saying, hey, look, I get it. You don't want to pay higher taxes, but we got to give people something. We got to at least show that, we got to at least pretend to do something, because otherwise, as he puts it, Canadians may withdraw their support for a growth agenda, which is another way of saying, they might vote for people who will actually raise your taxes. And we can't allow that.
No, yeah, you have to allay people's fears because, if they have all this fear and anxiety, then they won't sign on to the pro-growth. So he's just saying, like, go with me. I'm going to allay the dum-dums' fears, and we can still get all the growth that we all want.
Very much so, yeah.